Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Bible study and episode review in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm, of course, Shady Oak, and today we're going to be discussing episode 22 of season 9 of the TV show My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic. Growing up is hard to do. If you can turn to Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 20, hopefully you'll notice some similarities right off the bat, but we'll be discussing this wisdom book in light of today's episode and its themes. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 20. Wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief concourses. At the openings of the gates of the city, she speaks her words. How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? For scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn at my rebuke. Surely I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you, because I have called and you refused. I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you. Obvious references to today's episode aside, the book of Proverbs is full of these kinds of poetic devices in order to make its points. But before we get into those points, let's clarify what we're reading and how we're reading it. The Bible is organized into three categories: history, poetry, and prophecy. And knowing where you're at isn't necessarily hard to find out, but treating each passage like it's meant to be categorically is a mistake that people can easily make if we're not paying attention. Now, Proverbs is not only in the poetry section, but is written in the cultural context of ancient Hebrew. While the language differences are nil when discussing each passage and understanding them, the cultural background is worth noting. Hebrew culture, as well as Semitic cultures as a whole, live and breathe in the realm of contrast. And the comparison of the lesser to the greater, or the good to the not so good, this is how Hebrew poetry was formed. Instead of like in the English language, which, by the way, is the only language that does this, going from sound to sound in the sense of rhyme, and that's how we generally form poetry, Hebrew poetry would form from idea to idea. And this comes in four main ways: couplets, parables, personification, or if you want the fancy term, anthropomorphism, and enigma. The couplet is where, from the word couple, takes two different ideas and either compares the lesser to the greater, or it just shows the good compared to the not so good. These are your options. This is the majority of the book of Proverbs, by the way. If you go through chapters 10 all the way through 29, it's all couplets. So being familiar with that might help. Parables are illustrative stories, also used majority-wise by Jesus during his earthly ministry, that were used to make a point more relatable to even the most distracted of audiences. You could call My Little Pony as a whole a series of parables using horses to illustrate human problems, which brings us to the third type, personification. This is also comparable to My Little Pony in that it uses non-human things in order to, and expresses them with, human traits in order to communicate them more clearly and relatably to a human audience. In this proverb, for example, the one that we started with in chapter 1 and verse 20, wisdom is illustrated as a woman calling out to people to learn from her in the most publicly accessible place in the ancient world, the public city gates, where everyone would gather before there was Wi-Fi. So, noting that as well. And then finally, enigmas, just another word for mystery. It's basically asking a question and intentionally leaving it unanswered so that that in and of itself becomes a point. And these are especially appropriate when talking about the nature of God. You can find these in abundance in Proverbs chapter 30. But as far as the examples in today's episode, the majority of them were parables and couplets. Now, as far as this is concerned, and I guess the whole thing was personification, but as far as this is concerned, what examples did we see in the positive sense in today's episode of this kind of wisdom that's being offered in Proverbs? Well, Applejack, Rainbow Dash, and Rarity were all positive examples of what it means to be a literal grown up, not just old, but wise. In Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 12, we read, "There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." And by the way, Proverbs mentions this twice intentionally, as well as in chapter 16, because it is just that important. And we saw this illustrated quite plainly. The Cutie Mark Crusaders had one thing on their mind as kids. In fact, the same thing that every other kid has on their mind: fun. The greatest priority in life at the expense of all others. What could matter more than the fair? What could matter more than what seems right to me? And interestingly enough, there are even adults who live according to this philosophy. But Rarity, on the other hand, knew that maintaining excellence and integrity in your business does matter more. The definition and source of wisdom also agreed with her. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37, the famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Let your yes be yes and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one." This was in the context of talking about oaths. If Rarity said she would have it done a day early, that would put her, in the eyes of her customer, ahead of those who said, "Well, we'll just get it to you when we get it to you." Anyone can do that. But she had the wisdom to say, you know what, if I give someone my word, I'm going to keep it, even if it means I can't have fun now. That's wisdom. Likewise, Rainbow Dash knew that being a Wonderbolt wasn't just a title. It was a responsibility that came with being among the best flyers in Equestria. Jesus agreed with this when telling the parable of the just and unjust servant, a comparison of the lesser to the greater. Imagine a Jewish person being familiar with that. Luke chapter 12 and verse 48, this is what the parable all came to. You had an evil servant who just neglected his responsibilities, and you had a just servant who did his responsibilities even when his master wasn't watching. And Jesus ultimately brought it down when the just servant was rewarded and the evil servant was ultimately punished. He says, "For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required. And to whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more." Rainbow Dash, you're a talented flyer. That means that you're expected to perform at a higher level than just the average Pegasus. And we can also call this the Spider-Man parable if you want. The quote that's oftentimes used for the trilogy of "with great power comes great responsibility." It came from this line. Likewise, Applejack knew that there was a time and a place for fun. Neglecting sick family members isn't one of those times. Paul, who was a Jewish rabbi, by the way, also understood this based on his experience with the example of Jesus Christ. Philippians 2, verses 3 through 4. "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." Now note the couplet there. Is it saying that, well, you and then Jesus? Kind of. But it's saying, let you be like Jesus. It's almost as if it's an unasked question. Are you like Jesus? Well, this is how you do it. So then, noting that all as the positive example, someone who had more priorities in life than being fun, someone who understood the responsibilities of growing up isn't just the freedom to do what you want, but the ability to make sound decisions with what I want, with what needs to be done. By contrast, there were other examples of these lessons in a negative light. Going to, again, Proverbs 14 and verse 12, as well as chapter 16, I think the Cutie Mark Crusaders can be summarized basically in this. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." The Cutie Mark Crusaders thought being big was all it took, but the ability to solve problems, wisdom, doesn't just come naturally with size. It might introduce new problems, but generally not the, one-size-fits-all solution to all things in life. If I was just grown up, trust me, there are big babies who are just as much inept at life as you. The Cutie Mark Crusaders thought advice from grown-ups was always right, but also understood that good advice came from experience. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. My son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother, for they will be a graceful ornament on your head and chains about your neck. And note, we're not referring to chains like in the slavery sense. If you were an ambassador or someone with authority, high position in Hebrew society, you would wear a gold chain. That's how they'd recognize you. So understand that as well. If we're talking about someone who's perhaps got bad parents who've never given them any good advice, that I doubt, even if you have the worst example of parents, there is probably in them one good lesson. Don't do those sorts of things. But understand this and what we mean by this passage. We're talking about understanding, look, the people who have been around longer than you aren't giving you advice just so they can show off how right they are. They've learned the hard way that these things work. It was said that the school of hard knocks is the best education if you can afford the tuition. It's not easy oftentimes, or at least we don't make it easy to learn these important things in life. But come they will one way or another, and that's the real question, is are we going to learn them when they show up? When the Cutie Mark Crusaders made foolish decisions, well, what happened? Like we read in Proverbs chapter 1 verse 27 and what we saw in today's episode, a literal whirlwind destroyed everything. They made those foolish decisions in order to be able to enjoy. I love the name. Bluefy fulfilled Solomon's parable to the letter. And it continues from there, verse 28. Then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge, and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would have none of my counsel, and despised my every rebuke. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their own way, and be filled to the full with their own fancies. For turning away the simple will slay them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me, wisdom, will dwell safely, and will be secure without fear of evil. Like Fluttershy said, these things tend to come with experience, not with time. When we're talking about wisdom, we're referring to the ability to make good decisions. Not just knowing stuff, but knowing what to do with it, and where to find more of it. Like Fluttershy and Twilight, they didn't go around saying they knew everything. Twilight needed to check out a book because she didn't know. Imagine that, what this plant was for. Fluttershy didn't know everything about these cute little tornado bears or little puppies or whatever you want to call it. She had learned in time how to handle these sort of creatures, and even herself acknowledged that I can't train this creature. It needs to be done with the one who raised it. When we're talking about these things, we need to clarify and be consistent with that. We don't have all the answers, but we can point them to where we found them. So will I go around saying I know everything? No. I'll just point you to the only one who does by definition. And we'll finish with this, Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 11. The words of the wise are like goads. Once again, catch the parallel in today's episode. The words of scholars are like well-driven nails, given by one shepherd. And just pausing here, understand what a goad is. It's not something that you would intentionally harm the animal with. It was a series of planks with a nail inside of it that would keep the animal from going too far one way or another and staying on the right path. The nail would only irritate them, it would only poke them if they kept making the wrong move. And it would only injure them if they intentionally kept going that wrong direction. And that's the word of wisdom Solomon is using to illustrate this, as well as the name of the more wiser sister. Of making many books, further, my son, rather, be admonished by these, referring to the words of the wise. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. But let us hear the whole conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. When it's talking about wisdom, it's the ability to make good decisions. We've said this 3 times, and I'll say it a 4th if it's needed. When it ultimately comes to the decisions we have to make in life, it starts and ends with understanding one thing. We all will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. He will be the one to determine what we did with the life he's given us. You can foolishly try to explain away his existence at the expense of all science, logic, and philosophy. You can try to use those terms to mask the reality that this universe did have a creator, that design does have a designer, that morality does have a standard for what it is and what it isn't. We can talk about all the evidence of God's existence, but it starts and ends with the historical example that he's given us in history, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And ultimately, that will be the one thing that will cause us to stand or fall. I'm not perfect, and I'm not going to come to not only any of you, but to him and say, well, I was good enough. Oh, I did these studies Saturday mornings. Oh, I knew about God. Therefore, is that good enough? Not at all. Understand that there are things that have separated us from God. There are decisions that we have made that are foolish and that will ultimately put a rift between us and God forever. But he bridged that gap through the death of his Son, and he showed that it worked through a historically verifiable resurrection from the dead. Now that gives me hope, because if there was one thing that every single human being has to worry about, it's death. And if there is one man in history who broke that concept, that made death no longer a threat, and said, anyone who believes in me, even if he dies, he will live. Do you believe this? My answer is yes, and I hope the same can be said for you. If you have questions, sincere questions about the topics discussed in the study, please leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who would be blessed by this message, perhaps it's seen today's episode but not its themes, please share it with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you, and he has more to offer you than just correction. He offers you wisdom, the ability to make good decisions, the ability to look at life and say, you know what, I may not have all the answers, but I know where to find them. I may not always make good decisions, but I know who can restore me. Because, believe me, if we don't serve a God of mercy, we're toast. But wisdom is the ability to say, since we serve a God of mercy, we should probably take advantage of that.